Good morning. When Margaret called me to ask to speak today, it was a no-brainer. Of course, I would be happy to speak. I would be honored. I've known Ted for almost 50 years. Certainly there was much I could say. Margaret went on to ask, excuse me, if I would try and focus my comments on Ted the educator. That made sense. After all, that was the context in which we knew each other. Or was it? You see, you never, my sinuses are having a wonderful time with the snow. Excuse me. You never knew Ted in a simplistic, singular way. He was so many different things all at the same time. I knew Ted as a friend. I knew Ted as a mentor. I knew Ted as a colleague, and yes, I knew Ted as an educator. But I also knew Ted as a devoted father who cherished his family, and it was his family role that helped illuminate Ted for me. I almost met Ted Ward back in 1962, but I didn't. You see, I arrived that fall in Pontiac to do my student teaching. And Ted, who had been the director of Michigan State's Teacher Center in Pontiac, Michigan, left that fall to return to the MSU campus. However, 4 years later, in the fall of 1966, I returned to MSU to complete a graduate degree, and I finally met Ted Ward. As they say in Yiddish, it was beschert. It was meant to be. I had this great idea for how to improve the music instruction of blind children. I was told that I needed to talk to Ted Ward. I scheduled an appointment with him. We met for an hour, and at the end of that hour, Ted had managed to completely rework my idea. He made it so much better, and rather miraculously, he made me feel that I had done the reworking myself, that somehow I had been the one who had thought up the revisions. Amazing. Ted valued the thinking of the learner. Ted was so good at demonstrating to you that he valued your thinking. As you were describing an idea, you could see the wheels turning. He was listening. He was carefully considering what you were saying. You had his undivided attention. He was now in your corner, helping you think through and develop your idea, helping you along the path, not his path, your path. You could see the delight in his eyes. He helped you to better understand your own thinking. He was like a father excited to see his child ride a bicycle for the first time without training wheels. We did workshops together for a number of years, working with special education teachers in the Midwest. Imagine my feeling as a young educator to be able to share the lectern with Ted Ward. He made it a safe environment for me. If I started to stray in a discussion, Ted would sense it and help redirect the conversation. He would do it effortlessly. The training wheels were there whenever I needed them. After the workshop, the ride home was always a dialogue about what went well, what didn't go so well, and how we could do better the next time. This was Ted, the educator, at his best. I remember the time when Ted brought his second eldest son, Dan, hi Dan, along for a program we were doing in Indianapolis. Dan must have been in middle school at the time. At lunch, we were seated with the state director of special education. At one point, the lunch conversation moved to teachers and issues surrounding their quality. Without hesitation, Dan's hand shot up, and he announced, "I know how to solve the problem." All attention was now directed toward Dan as he continued, "Fire all the teachers." Ted beamed. He was so proud of Dan and how he was able to speak up. And if you know Dan, to this very day, he is still raising his hand and willing to make announcements that may startle some people. Ted loved technology and how technology could be engineered to improve learning opportunities. He liked using the word engineer. He saw himself as an engineer, an educational engineer, standing between science and application, looking for creative ways to apply science to solving problems of teaching and learning. I remember in the late 60s how absolutely fascinated he was by the amount of information that could be stored on a simple little audio cassette. There was a period of time when each day he would have another great idea for using audio cassettes in education. He was so challenged to latch on to a technology and then brainstorm new and creative ways by which that technology could assist the learning process. Ted, of course, was well aware that educational technology came in all sorts of packages, some very elaborate and some very simple. And probably the most simple for Ted was the restaurant napkin. Ted and I would find time once every week or so to have lunch together and talk about new projects and ideas. And of course, Ted would write it down. He was always writing it down. He never seemed to have a full sheet of paper. He was always using and reusing small scraps of paper. But a restaurant napkin? Sheer luxury. I remember some hectic mornings rummaging through all of my pockets looking for that crumpled up napkin, fearing that a new idea might be lost forever. Until meeting Ted, I hadn't realized that restaurant napkins were appropriate technology for education. Ted was so unbelievably inventive. It wasn't sufficient to take things out of a catalog of educational ideas and then just pop them into a learning situation. No, Ted was challenged to move and stretch ideas, to recreate them, to transform them. If an instructional idea was really worth something, it was certainly worthy of being further invented. Having learners in your classroom introduce themselves was a worthy activity. However, how much more powerful it could be if you had them introduce each other, or open an envelope that contained a question they had to answer on the spot. He was always inventive, looking for ways to demonstrate how to improve our educational practice. About 99% of the time, his inventiveness was simple yet brilliant. Then there was the other 1%, when you just shook your head. Picture the day Ted declared that he had greatly improved the performance of his home stereo speakers. How did you do that, Ted? Well, you remember those large bass speakers I have in the living room? They were suffering because they didn't have enough reverberation to really make the low notes stand out. Why not use the basement to provide the reverberation? Sort of like a huge echo chamber. So yesterday I cut 2 holes in our living room floor, and I suspended the speakers so they were half in the living room and half in the basement. Now when I turn up the bass, the whole house vibrates. Ted was inventive. Ted firmly believed that it was okay to criticize an idea as long as you could improve it, build upon it. To merely criticize the thinking of someone else had such negative consequences. To build upon the ideas meant so much more to the learner. I watched Ted implement this principle over and over again. A student would describe what I would consider a very naive idea that was lacking in so many ways. Ted saw the same shortcomings. He spoke them aloud and then went on to suggest adjustments to the idea to make it better. He was always challenged to improve and build upon the learner's idea. And as I mentioned in my very first meeting with Ted, he managed to do it in a way that left the ownership of the idea in the lap of the learner. Then there was the day I bumped into Sarah in a hallway in the College of Education. She asked if I had a few minutes. Sarah was in medical school at the time and evidently had used her dad's idea of criticizing an idea and then making it better. The problem? She had done it with one of her professors. I think she feared that her medical career was about to end. I did a lot of head nodding as she talked about it. She worried that her father would be disappointed in her. I knew he wouldn't be. Sometimes the learner has to help the teacher become an educator. Ted demonstrated unwavering support of the learner. You could always sense Ted's support of you. You could sense his willingness to help His unwavering support for you encouraged the trust that is so essential for learning. With Ted, this trust and support permeated everything. I remember the time I was teaching an evening class at Michigan State. I arrived home around 10 o'clock to find Ted sound asleep on the couch. Robbie reported that shortly after I had left home to go teach, our youngest daughter, Michelle, came running into the kitchen and pronounced, "It's raining in the family room." And sure enough, a pipe had burst and water was pouring down the wall. Not knowing what to do, Robbie called Ted. Ted told her how to turn off the water. He collected a bunch of tools from his house, drove the 5 miles to our home, ripped open the ceiling, assessed the situation, went to a local hardware store, bought the necessary parts to repair the leak, and still had enough time for an hour nap before I returned home. Once home, it took us only a short time until everything was working again. How very fortunate for me as a learner that I had this trust and support from such a phenomenal educator. It provided a strong foundation for my own development as an educator. When Ted directed the Learning Systems Institute at Michigan State, one of the first people he hired was a researcher who was working on the development of a computer-based system for randomly retrieving information. Ted had the vision and foresight to understand that being able to speedily retrieve information as needed would be the cornerstone to a future information age. And the model Ted had for such a system was Ted himself. It was how he operated as an educator. Ted always had a myriad of ideas running through his mind, always ready to be retrieved and applied when needed. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Margaret and the essential role that she played in providing a foundation for Ted's work. Margaret was always there, seemingly a step behind Ted, but in reality, walking clearly alongside Ted. I remember how Ted had to carefully plot how he would get her signature on a passport application without Margaret being aware. Ted wanted her to accompany him on his next overseas trip, but he knew she would find excuses for staying home and tending to the family. If she had an updated passport, his chances of getting her to travel with him would be greatly increased. And they were. You never saw Ted walking by without a handful of papers or a briefcase filled to capacity with all sorts of stuff he was working on. One day I asked Ted if he was aware that one of the building's elevators had gotten stuck that morning. Ted responded that he was not only aware of it, he was in it. He said that he had been alone in the elevator when it ground to a halt. I asked, "What did you do?" His response, "Nothing." He said he quickly realized that he was in a wonderfully quiet environment, no telephone and no one to disturb him. So he sat down on the floor, opened his briefcase, and started to work, never once pushing the emergency button. When he was rescued, an hour later, he just smiled and contentedly walked to his office. Ted also had time to build boats in his basement, remodel a bus for family outings, capture 1 million images on his 35-millimeter camera, keep up on the latest classical music recordings, and periodically play flute duets with Margaret. When we traveled together overseas, he was always wanting to play "What do you imagine that is?" A simple game of trying to hypothesize the purpose of some sort of unusual object he would spot. He was a proponent of, "If you build it, they will come," whereby he would conjure up an idea for a special workshop or institute and find ways for it to happen. And it would happen. As Ted traveled the world, people always knew how to find him, and he was always being spirited away to provide some needed feedback to a non-formal education project of some sort. For the first few years that I worked with Ted, I didn't have the vaguest idea what I wanted to be in life. I so very much enjoyed my work. At every turn, I was learning something new and exciting. I watched Ted, and I learned so much from him. But where was it all heading? When would I find out what I was going to be when I grew up? When I shared this concern with Ted, he had the answer. Maybe you're already there. Maybe you are who you are going to be. That was an unbelievably liberating moment for me. Ted had empowered me to become who I was. I miss Ted an awful lot. I cannot begin to understand where my life would have taken me without Ted Ward helping to point the way. Thank you.